The headlights carved through Appalachian darkness like desperate prayers, while Martha Jenkins gripped the steering wheel with hands that knew the weight of empty promises and broken dreams. The floorboards groaned their familiar warning as Martha crept through the house at 4:17 a.m., each step a whispered conspiracy against the suffocating quiet that had settled over the West Virginia holler like dust on forgotten furniture. 6 months. 6 months since Hank's work boots had last left muddy prints by the door, since his coffee cup had steamed on the kitchen table, since his promises of "just a short haul, darling," had dissolved into the kind of silence that pressed against your chest until breathing became a conscious act. The children slept curled together in the back bedroom. Emma, 7, with her father's stubborn cowlick, and little Jake, barely 4, still clutching the toy truck that had lost a wheel 3 Christmases ago. Martha stood in their doorway, watching their peaceful faces in the pale moonlight filtering through curtains that needed washing but somehow never got washed. Her hands, cracked from the drought-baked earth and endless worry, trembled as she touched the doorframe where Hank had carved their heights each birthday, tiny notches that now felt like accusations. The eviction notice lay crumpled on the kitchen counter where she'd thrown it the day before, its red lettering bleeding through the thin paper like a wound that wouldn't heal. 60 days, it had said, but Martha knew better. Men in clean suits didn't wait for mountains to move, and she was just another woman in a holler full of women whose husbands had chased work into the dark and never found their way home. The house groaned around her, its bones settling deeper into the hillside as if trying to disappear entirely. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, cataloging her own haunting: the kitchen where she'd learned to stretch beans and cornbread until they fed 3, the living room where the television played static more often than programs, the bedroom where Hank's side of the bed had grown cold as winter ground. Each step carried the weight of 18 years, of dreams that had slowly withered like the garden she could no longer afford to tend. The pickup truck sat in the driveway like a faithful hound, rusted but running, held together by prayer and stubbornness and the kind of mechanical sympathy that came from necessity rather than knowledge. Martha had loaded it the night before: 3 cardboard boxes, 2 garbage bags full of clothes, and a cooler with enough food to last maybe 2 days if they were careful. Everything else, the furniture, the photographs, the accumulated debris of a life built on shifting ground, would stay behind like artifacts of a civilization that had simply stopped believing in itself. As she lifted Emma from her bed, the child stirred but didn't wake, her small body trusting in the way that broke Martha's heart and mended it simultaneously. Jake came next, heavier in sleep, his breathing steady against her shoulder as she carried him to the truck. The night air bit through her thin jacket, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke, the smell of autumn in the mountains where seasons changed like everything else, slowly, then all at once. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, coughing to life with the reluctant wheeze of something too old to quit but too tired to run well. Martha sat for a moment in the driver's seat, her children buckled safely behind her, and looked back at the house that had sheltered 4 generations of her family. The porch light flickered once, as if waving goodbye, then died completely, another small failure in a long chain of small failures that had somehow added up to flight. She put the truck in reverse and began the slow journey down the mountain, the headlights catching glimpses of familiar landmarks that would soon become memories. The old oak where Emma had learned to climb, the creek where Jake had caught his first minnow, the bend in the road where you could see clear to Virginia on a good day, all of it sliding past the windows like scenes from someone else's life. The gas gauge hovered just above empty, and Martha had exactly $47 in her wallet, enough to get them somewhere, though she wasn't entirely sure where somewhere might be. Her cousin Dolly had a place down in Georgia, had mentioned it once during a phone call that felt like a lifetime ago. It wasn't much, Dolly had said, just an old sharecropper's cabin on the edge of some forgotten farmland, but it had a roof and walls and might buy them time to figure out what came next. Time. The word felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. For 6 months, time had meant waiting. Waiting for Hank to call, waiting for work to come, waiting for miracles that seemed to have taken the same road out of town as her husband. Now, driving through the pre-dawn darkness with her children's soft breathing the only sound besides the truck's labored engine, time felt different. Not empty, exactly, but full of possibility that scared her more than the emptiness had. The radio crackled to life as they reached the bottom of the mountain, catching the edge of a gospel station from somewhere across the state line. A woman's voice, rough with faith and cigarettes, sang about walking through valleys and fearing no evil, and Martha felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something that might grow into hope if given enough darkness to take root in. 3 days and 200 miles later, Martha found herself standing in the doorway of a cabin that time had forgotten to maintain, watching her children explore their new home with the adaptability that both amazed and broke her heart. The structure leaned slightly to the left, as if it had grown tired of standing straight, and the front porch sagged under the weight of too many seasons. But the roof held, the walls were solid, and Cousin Dolly had left a note on the kitchen table along with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. "Welcome home, honey," the note read in Dolly's careful cursive. "Ain't much, but it's yours as long as you need it. Pot roast in the dish should last y'all a couple days. There's a general store about 5 miles down the road toward town. Mr. Patterson, who runs it, is good people. Don't be proud, Martha. Sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing we can do. Love, D." The casserole was still warm, and Martha realized her cousin must have driven out that morning, must have been watching for their arrival from her house 20 miles away. It was the kind of quiet kindness that snuck up on you when you weren't expecting it, the kind that made your throat tight and your eyes burn with gratitude you didn't know how to express. Emma and Jake had claimed the small back bedroom, spreading their few toys across the floor with a serious concentration of children, making a new place feel like home. The cabin's previous tenants had left behind a few pieces of furniture, a kitchen table worn smooth by countless meals, 2 mismatched chairs, and an old iron bed frame that Martha would learn to appreciate during the long nights when sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. That first evening, as they shared the pot roast by the light of a single bare bulb, Jake looked up from his plate with the solemn expression he'd worn since they'd left West Virginia. "Mama," he said quietly, "when is Daddy coming to find us?" The question hit Martha like a physical blow, and she saw Emma's forked paws halfway to her mouth, her 7-year-old eyes suddenly too old and too knowing. They had asked this question before, in different ways, at different times, and Martha had deflected it with vague promises and gentle misdirection. But sitting in this strange cabin, surrounded by the accumulated kindness of people who barely knew them, she felt the weight of her children's need for truth. "I don't know, baby," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't know if Daddy is looking for us or if he's still looking for whatever took him away in the first place. But I know we're here together, and we're safe, and that's what matters right now." It wasn't the answer Jake wanted. She could see that in the way his small shoulders slumped, but it was the only honest answer she had to give. Emma reached across the table and patted her brother's hand with the kind of maternal instinct that 4-year-old boys sometimes brought out in their older sisters, and Martha felt her heart crack open just a little bit more. The next morning brought her first encounter with Mr. Patterson, the store owner Dolly had mentioned. He was a tall, weathered man in his 60s with the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime of work under an unforgiving sun. His store occupied the ground floor of a building that might have been grand once, back when the railroad still ran through town and people had reasons to stop and stay a while. Martha had walked the 5 miles with both children in tow, their small hands clasped firmly in hers as they navigated the narrow country road. She'd counted and recounted the money in her wallet, $34 and change, and made a mental list of absolute necessities: milk, bread, something that could stretch into several meals. Mr. Patterson watched her shop with the careful attention of someone who had seen plenty of young mothers trying to make impossible math work out in their favor. He didn't say anything when she put back the name-brand cereal in favor of the store brand, or when she chose the smallest container of laundry detergent on the shelf. But when she approached the counter with her carefully curated basket, he began adding items she hadn't selected. "Ground beef was going bad anyway," he said gruffly, tossing a package into a paper bag. "And these apples are past their prime for the fancy folks, but they'll make good eating for children." A loaf of the expensive bread followed, then a gallon of milk instead of the half-gallon she'd chosen. Martha started to protest, her pride rising like a tide, but Mr. Patterson fixed her with a look that was both stern and kind. "Young lady," he said quietly, "I've been running this store for 37 years, and I've learned to spot the difference between people who won't work and people who can't catch a break. You walked 5 miles with 2 little ones just to stretch your dollars as far as they'd go. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." He rang up only the items she'd originally selected, ignoring the additions completely. "Now," he continued, "there's some folks around here might have work for someone willing to do it. Nothing fancy, mind you. Cleaning houses, watching kids, helping with harvest when the time comes. You interested in hearing about it?" Martha nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The children pressed close to her legs, sensing something important was happening, even if they didn't understand exactly what. "Mrs. Coleman, about 3 miles back toward your place. She's been looking for help with her elderly mother. Nothing too heavy. Cooking, cleaning, keeping the old woman company. She's fair with her wages and patient with people learning the routine. And the Hendersons' farm always needs extra hands come harvest time. It's seasonal work, but it's honest pay for honest work." As they walked home, paper bags heavy with unexpected abundance, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. Not better, necessarily, but different in ways that mattered. Emma and Jake chattered excitedly about the free candy Mr. Patterson had slipped into their bags, their voices bright with the kind of joy that came from simple, unexpected sweetness. That night, after the children were asleep, Martha sat on the cabin's front porch and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of Georgia countryside, crickets and night birds and the distant lowing of cattle from farms hidden beyond the darkness. The air smelled different here, less sharp than the mountain air she'd known all her life, softer somehow, heavy with the promise of things growing. She thought about Mr. Patterson's kindness, about Dolly's casserole and warm welcome, about the way strangers had opened their hands to help people they barely knew. It didn't erase the hurt of Hank's abandonment or solve the practical problems of building a new life from scratch, but it shifted something inside her, a recognition that the world held more than just disappointment and broken promises. 2 weeks into their new life, Martha had settled into a routine that felt almost sustainable. She cleaned house for Mrs. Coleman 3 mornings a week, earning enough to cover gas and groceries with a little left over for the small emergencies that seemed to crop up whenever you were least prepared for them. Emma had started at the local elementary school, walking the half-mile to the bus stop each morning with the serious determination of a child adapting to circumstances beyond her control. Jake spent his days with Martha, quiet and observant, taking in their new world with the careful attention of someone learning to read the signs. It was on a Thursday morning, while Martha was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, that she first noticed the remnants of the chicken coop. Half hidden by tall grass and wild vines, the structure listed to one side like everything else on the property, its wire mesh torn and rusted, its wooden frame weathered gray by seasons of neglect. She'd walked past it dozens of times without really seeing it, but something about the morning light caught the angles just right, and suddenly she could picture it as it must have been, a busy, productive little homestead where families had raised their own food and built their lives one day at a time. Jake wandered over while she stood contemplating the ruins, his small hand slipping into hers with the unconscious trust that still caught her off guard. "What's that, Mama?" he asked, pointing at the collapsed structure. "Used to be a chicken coop, I think," Martha replied, surprised by the wistfulness in her own voice. "People who lived here before us probably raised chickens for eggs and meat. It's how folks used to live, growing what they needed, taking care of themselves." "Could we have chickens?" Jake's question was casual, the kind of idle wondering that children specialized in, but it lodged itself in Martha's mind like a splinter. The next morning brought an answer she hadn't been expecting. Martha woke before dawn, as had become her habit, and made her way to the kitchen to start the coffee. Through the window above the sink, she caught sight of movement near the old coop, a flash of russet and gold in the pre-dawn gloom. She pressed her face to the glass, squinting in the dim light, and there it was, a rooster, scraggly and weather-beaten, picking its way through the tall grass with the deliberate movements of something that had learned to be careful. The bird was alone, which struck her as odd. Roosters were flock animals, meant to strut and protect their hens, to crow at dawn and maintain order in the natural hierarchy of the barnyard. This one moved with the careful solitude of something that had lost its purpose but hadn't quite figured out how to quit. Martha watched as the rooster approached the ruined coop, scratching at the hard-packed earth with systematic persistence. There was nothing visible there. No scattered feed, no obvious insects or seeds, but the bird continued its methodical search, as if believing that persistence alone might conjure sustenance from barren ground. Then, just as the sun crested the tree line, the rooster lifted its head and crowed. But it wasn't the proud, territorial call Martha remembered from her childhood visits to her grandmother's farm. This was something else entirely, rough and desperate, off-key in a way that made her chest tight. It was the sound of something calling out to an empty world, hoping against evidence that someone might answer. "That's a strange sound," Jake said from behind her, and Martha startled. She hadn't heard him get up, but there he was in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes as he joined her at the window. "Yes," Martha agreed quietly. "It is strange." They watched together as the rooster continued its solitary routine, scratching and pecking at ground that offered nothing obvious in return. The bird's feathers were dull and patchy, its comb pale, but its movements held a stubborn determination that was both heartbreaking and oddly inspiring. "Why doesn't it have any chickens?" Jake asked with the direct curiosity of childhood. Martha considered the question, watching as the rooster found some invisible morsel and tilted its head back to swallow. "I don't know, baby. Maybe they got scattered somehow. Maybe this one just hasn't found its way back to them yet." But even as she said it, Martha suspected the truth was simpler and sadder. This rooster, like them, was making do with whatever circumstances had left behind. It had adapted to solitude not by choice but by necessity, finding its own reasons to scratch and search and call out to the dawn even when the dawn felt empty of promise. Over the following days, the rooster became a regular presence, appearing each morning to conduct its lonely vigil by the broken coop. Martha found herself timing her morning routine around its arrival, brewing her coffee so she could watch from the kitchen window as it went through its ritual of survival. There was something hypnotic about the bird's persistence, the way it returned day after day to the same barren patch of ground, convinced that effort itself might be enough to sustain life. Emma noticed the rooster too, pointing it out on her way to catch the school bus. "Mama, why does that chicken crow at the wrong time?" she asked one morning, her backpack slung over one shoulder as she waited for the distant rumble of the bus engine. "What do you mean, honey?" "Roosters are supposed to crow when the sun comes up," Emma explained with the authority of a 7-year-old who had learned this fact somewhere and held on to it. "But this one crows when the sun is already up high. It's like it's confused about what time it is." Martha looked out at the rooster, scratching determinedly at the noon-bright earth, and felt something shift inside her chest. Emma was right. The bird did crow at odd hours, as if operating on a schedule that had nothing to do with natural rhythms and everything to do with some internal need to announce its existence to a world that had mostly stopped listening. That afternoon, while Jake napped and the house was quiet, Martha found herself walking out to the ruined coop. The rooster was there, as she'd somehow known it would be, standing in the shade of the collapsed structure with the patient stillness of something waiting for a purpose that might never arrive. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle the bird, and sat down on a piece of fallen timber about 10 feet away. The rooster regarded her with one bright, suspicious eye, then resumed its careful exploration of the ground. Up close, Martha could see how thin it was, how its feathers lay flat against its body in a way that spoke of stress and inadequate nutrition. But there was something unbroken in its bearing, a dignity that hadn't been eroded by circumstances. "You and me both, aren't we?" Martha said quietly, and the rooster paused in its scratching to fix her with that sharp, evaluating stare. "Both of us trying to make something out of nothing, both of us calling out to folks who probably aren't listening anymore." She thought about Hank, about the way he used to wake before dawn and stumble to the kitchen in his work clothes, already running late for whatever job was paying that week. She'd made his coffee and packed his lunch and kissed him goodbye, never thinking that one morning he simply wouldn't come back to claim the routine they'd built together. She thought about her children, adapting with a resilience that broke her heart, finding ways to be okay in circumstances that weren't their choosing. The rooster crowed then, that harsh, untimely sound that had begun to punctuate Martha's days, and she felt tears she hadn't known were coming. Not tears of self-pity, exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or a kind of exhausted admiration for the simple fact of persistence in the face of abandonment. "We're still here," she said to the rooster, to herself, to the empty Georgia sky that stretched endless and indifferent above them. "Against all odds and common sense, we're still here." The bird tilted its head as if considering her words, then returned to its patient, hopeless, necessary work of survival. October arrived like a whispered promise, painting the Georgia countryside in shades of gold and amber that reminded Martha of better times without quite breaking her heart. She'd been working steady for Mrs. Coleman for 6 weeks now, and the routine had become something approaching comfortable. 3 mornings a week caring for the elderly woman who called her dear, and always sent her home with leftover soup or a jar of preserves from her late husband's garden. Emma had found her footing at school, making friends with the easy adaptability of children who learned early that home was wherever your family happened to be. Jake still clung close to Martha's side, but his questions about Daddy came less frequently now, replaced by observations about their new world that showed he was beginning to see it as theirs rather than a temporary stopping place. The rooster had become part of their daily landscape, reliable as sunrise even if its timing remained mysteriously its own. Martha no longer thought of it as strange that a solitary bird should crow at noon or mid-afternoon, announcing its presence to an empty farmland that had learned to exist without the busy activity of working livestock. There was something almost companionable about its persistence, the way it had claimed the ruins of the coop as its territory and Martha's family as its reluctant audience. It was on a crisp Thursday morning, while Martha was sweeping the cabin's small front porch, that she noticed the rooster doing something different. Instead of its usual methodical scratching around the coop's perimeter, the bird was pulling at the wild vines that had grown over the wire mesh, tugging with sharp, purposeful movements at the green tendrils that had claimed the structure as their own. Martha set down her broom and walked closer, curious about this change in routine. The rooster paused in its work to eye her warily, then resumed its vine-pulling with what seemed like renewed determination. As she watched, she began to see method in its movements. The bird was clearing a section of the mesh, creating a gap just large enough for itself to squeeze through. "What are you up to, old man?" Martha asked quietly, and the rooster fixed her with that bright, evaluating stare that had become familiar. Over the next several days, she watched as the rooster systematically cleared more of the coop, pulling vines and pecking at rust-weakened wire until it had created a space that was recognizably shelter again. The bird began spending its nights inside the partially restored structure, and Martha realized with a start that it was preparing for winter, not just surviving day to day, but planning for the months ahead with a kind of practical wisdom that came from experience with hardship. The sight of the rooster working to rebuild its world, one vine at a time, stirred something in Martha that she hadn't felt since the night they'd fled West Virginia. It wasn't hope, exactly, but something more solid than hope, a recognition that survival could be active rather than passive, that making do could become making better if you were willing to work at it. That weekend, while the children played in the cabin's small yard, Martha walked out to the hardware store's remnant bin behind Mr. Patterson's general store. She'd noticed it before during their weekly shopping trips, a collection of odds and ends too damaged or outdated to sell at full price, but still functional for someone willing to overlook cosmetic flaws. She found a roll of chicken wire with a small tear in one corner, marked down to $3. A partial bag of fence staples, probably left over from someone's larger project. A few pieces of lumber, weathered but solid, that might work to shore up the coop's sagging frame. Mr. Patterson appeared as she was loading her finds into the truck's bed, his expression curious but not questioning. "Thinking about raising chickens?" he asked mildly. "Maybe," Martha replied, surprising herself with the answer. "Or maybe just fixing something that's been broken too long." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. Mrs. Henderson mentioned she's got some laying hens she needs to find homes for. Her flock's gotten too big for her coop, and she'd rather give them to someone who'll care for them than sell them to the processor in town. Might be worth a conversation if you're serious about this. That evening, after the children were asleep, Martha sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watched the rooster settle itself inside its partially rebuilt shelter. The bird had worked all day on its improvements, and there was something satisfied in its bearing as it tucked its head under its wing for the night. She thought about the chain of small kindnesses that had brought them to this point: Dolly's casserole and shelter, Mr. Patterson's extra groceries and job referrals, Mrs. Coleman's patient teaching and generous spirit. Each act of grace had built on the others, creating a foundation solid enough to support not just survival but the possibility of something better. The next morning, the rooster crowed at sunrise for the first time since Martha had been watching it. Not the harsh, desperate call she'd grown accustomed to, but something closer to the proud territorial announcement she remembered from childhood visits to working farms. The sound carried across the quiet countryside like a declaration, and Martha felt an answering stirring in her own chest. She spent the morning repairing the coop while Jake helped by handing her nails and offering commentary on her work. The physical labor felt good, purposeful in a way that cleaning other people's houses, necessary as it was, could never quite achieve. Her hands, already tough from months of hard work, adapted quickly to the rhythm of hammer and wire, building and mending. Emma arrived home from school to find the coop nearly restored, its wire mesh intact and its frame reinforced with the salvaged lumber. The rooster patrolled the perimeter with obvious approval, inspecting Martha's work with the critical eye of someone who understood the importance of solid construction. "Are we really getting chickens, Mama?" Emma asked, her 7-year-old voice careful with hope. "Mrs. Henderson has some hens that need a home," Martha replied, testing the gate she'd fashioned from scrap wood and salvaged hinges. "If they like it here, maybe they'll stay." That afternoon, they drove the short distance to the Henderson farm, where a kind-faced woman in her 60s led them to a well-maintained coop filled with busy, healthy hens. Mrs. Henderson had selected 4 birds for them, 3 reliable layers and 1 younger hen that showed promise. "This old girl here," she said, pointing to a rust-colored hen with intelligent eyes, "she's my best producer. Lays an egg almost every day, regular as clockwork. And these 2 are good steady layers, nothing fancy but dependable." The 4th bird, smaller and more skittish than the others, pecked nervously at the ground. "This little one's just finding her rhythm, but she'll come around with time." They loaded the hens into borrowed carriers and drove home through the late afternoon light, the birds clucking and murmuring in the truck bed with the resigned patience of creatures accustomed to human plans. Back at the cabin, Martha released them into their new home while the rooster watched from a respectful distance. The hens explored their space with the thorough attention of experienced tenants, checking the corners for threats and testing the quality of the roosting bars Martha had installed. Gradually, as they satisfied themselves that the accommodations were acceptable, they began to settle into the natural rhythms of a flock, pecking at the ground, ruffling their feathers into place, establishing the social hierarchies that would govern their lives together. The rooster approached cautiously, as if unsure of his welcome after months of solitude. The largest hen, Mrs. Henderson's reliable layer, fixed him with a stern stare that seemed to convey both acceptance and expectations about his behavior. After a moment of tense negotiation that involved much puffing of feathers and strategic positioning, the rooster was admitted to the group with the conditional approval that all social integration required. That evening, as Martha watched her small flock settle in for the night, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before Hank's departure, the satisfaction of having built something that would last. Not just repaired or maintained or made do with, but actually created something new from the wreckage of what had come before. Jake pressed against her side, warm and solid in the cooling air. "Will they lay eggs for us, Mama?" "I think they will, baby. I think they'll give us eggs and maybe even some baby chicks if we take good care of them." Emma joined them at the fence, her backpack still slung over one shoulder from the school bus. "Look," she said softly, pointing into the coop. The rooster isn't crowing crazy anymore. Martha looked where her daughter was pointing and saw that the rooster had positioned itself near the henhouse door, alert and protective in the way that roosters were meant to be. Its bearing had changed from the desperate solitude she'd grown accustomed to. It stood taller now, with a confident posture of something that had found its purpose again. As if summoned by their attention, the rooster turned toward them and crowed, not the harsh, untimely call of abandonment, but the clear, proud announcement of a bird that had work to do and companions to protect. The sound carried across the Georgia countryside like a promise, like the first note of a song that Martha was just beginning to remember how to sing. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the farm sounds had settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, Martha sat on her front porch and listened to the gentle murmuring of hens settling in for the night. In the distance, she could hear the faint rumble of traffic on the highway, people traveling to destinations she might never know, but the sound felt less lonely now, part of a larger world that included this small corner of Georgia where a broken rooster had learned to crow true again. She thought about Hank, about the life they'd built and lost, about the future that stretched ahead uncertain but no longer empty. The hurt was still there, would probably always be there in some form, but it had changed shape. No longer the crushing weight of abandonment, but something she could carry without being crushed by it. The rooster crowed once more, a good-night call to the settling darkness, and Martha smiled at the sound. Not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs, rough and real and stubbornly hopeful, the sound of creatures who had learned that standing up was something you did not once, but every single day until it became the thing that defined you. Tomorrow there would be eggs to collect, children to feed, work to do. Tomorrow there would be the 1,000 small tasks that made up a life built from scratch on ground that had seemed barren but turned out to be just waiting for someone willing to tend it. Tonight there was this, the sound of a rooster calling to the Georgia sky, the rustle of settling hens, the quiet breathing of her children safe in their beds. It was enough. More than enough. It was the sound of standing. If Martha Jenkins' story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet strength that lives in ordinary people facing impossible circumstances, or if it lit a small flame of hope in your own journey, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that resilience grows in unexpected places. And of course, subscribe to our channel. Here we tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that grace still exists, even in the forgotten corners of our world. Until next time, never stop listening for the sound of your own strength calling you home.